American pressure growing on Saudi Arabia over missing journalist Jamal Khashoggi. President Donald Trump says he's worried, and the U.S. Secretary of State is urging the kingdom to support a thorough investigation. Will the Turkish allegations of murder be a turning point in relations between the allies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hoda Abdel-Hamid. A week after his mysterious disappearance at Saudi Arabia's consulate in Turkey, U.S. leaders are voicing their fears for Jamal Khashoggi. Donald Trump says he's concerned. The vice president says he's troubled by the disappearance. And America's top diplomat Mike Pompeo is urging Saudi allies to be open about what happened. Stephanie Decker has more from Istanbul.
It's an ominous image. Jamal Khashoggi on security camera video entering the Saudi consulate last Tuesday. His fiancée, who accompanied him to the consulate, has verified it. It's the last time he has been seen in public. Just a few days ago, the Saudi journalist spoke to BBC Radio.
When I hear of an arrest of a friend who did nothing that worth to be arrested, make me feel I shouldn't go. I'm talking. That friend of mine who was arrested wasn't even talking. Maybe he was talking critically over something in a dinner party.
Right.
That's what we are becoming in Saudi Arabia.
Right,
we are not used to that. Recently, a Saudi columnist, an economist, who was close to the royal court, got arrested, and that scared many people because here we are talking about somebody who's close to the government.
Right.
I don't even want to use the term a dissent.
Dissident, yeah.
They're not dissidents.
Right.
I mean, the people who are arrested are not even being dissidents.
Right.
They just have an independent mind.
Right.
Until now, I don't call myself an opposition.
Right.
I always say I am just a writer. I want a free environment to write and speak my mind.
Turkish sources say they believe he was killed inside the consulate. Saudi Arabia categorically denies that. Saudi authorities have now said they will allow Turkish investigators inside the consulate to continue their investigation. But this opposition member and human rights activist says he is skeptical anything will be found.
It seems like a professional job. It's already been 7 days. If the Saudis weren't sure about themselves, they would not let the Turkish authorities in.
After almost a week of silence, the US president and a close Saudi ally had this to say.
Right now, nobody knows anything about it, but there's some pretty bad stories going around. I do not like it.
The US Secretary of State is asking Saudi Arabia to support a thorough investigation into the disappearance. The Saudis did give a tour of the building to a group of journalists on Saturday. The consul opening a small cabinet and what appears to be a fuse box in an effort to show Jamal Khashoggi was not there. There are a lot of allegations and much speculation about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi here inside the Saudi consulate, but Turkey hasn't yet provided any evidence to back up their beliefs that he may have been murdered here, and Saudi hasn't provided any proof that he ever left. The only thing we know for sure is that Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate a week ago, and no one has seen or heard from him since. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, Istanbul.
Okay, so let's bring in our guest. Joining us from New York is Ambassador Richard Murphy. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. In Fairfax, Virginia, we have Khalil Jahshan. He is the executive director of the Arab Center, Washington. And finally joining us here in Doha, Marwan Kabalan. He is the director of policy analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Welcome to all of you. Ambassador Murphy, let me start with you. It took a week, but finally President Trump and other members of the administration have weighed in on the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Why do you think it took so long?
Well, I think there's been a shortage of facts beyond the time that Jamal Khashoggi entered the consulate and hasn't been seen since this past week. It's been a long-established close relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And I think the American leadership is handling this very carefully. It wants to know, have a full revelation of what's gone on without precipitously attacking, criticizing the Saudi authorities.
Okay, well, Khalil, but nevertheless, Washington has joined this chorus of condemnation. Do you think it's something that at this stage would worry the royal family in Saudi Arabia, and specifically Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman?
I don't know if it already began to worry him, but it should. Frankly, what Ambassador Murphy just said, the special relationship between the two countries, the love affair, so-called, between the two sides that both President Trump and the Crown Prince referred to, just a few days ago, with the Crown Prince saying, "I love to work with this man." And the president saying he loves the king and he loves the kingdom before he criticized it again last week. Putting all that aside, the fact of the matter, this is going to impact the relationship. Yes, it is a strategic relationship that has lasted for decades. But right now, it's at the mercy of this political hurricane, Hurricane Jamal. That could prove to be category 4 or 5, depends on the results of the investigation. But the fact that the U.S. waited so long, I mean, the absence of facts, I agree with the ambassador, faced everybody. But how come did Germany and France and England, all the allies, spoke much faster than the United States? Maybe the fact that we don't have an ambassador there has impacted the situation. As a matter of fact, we don't have a U.S. ambassador in Riyadh, and we don't have one in Ankara either. So this administration, I don't think, has handled this crisis in a responsible manner and quickly enough.
Well, Marwan, at this stage, we don't have the full picture, but many are fearing that the worst could have happened to Jamal Khashoggi. Now, how do you think this is going to unpan? Do you think this is actually a blunt case of the Saudis carrying out a execution on a diplomatic premises, or do you think it looks more like something that just went out of control?
Well, Hoda, I think it's very difficult to understand Saudi foreign policy in recent years. I don't know also who's running this policy anyway, because for me, it's irrational. It's not smart at all. The Saudis, they have been moving from one crisis, diplomatic crisis, to another with their neighbors, with foreign governments. Last year, it was with Qatar, recently with Canada, with Germany, and today we are having another one with Turkey, actually, whether abducting or, I mean, over the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. We still need to know actually the fate of
we need answers from all sides at this stage.
Of course, but what I meant actually is this is not a smart foreign policy, and the guys who are running this policy actually are putting it's very difficult to understand whose interest this foreign policy is actually serving, because having these problems with so many countries, it's not good for Saudi Arabia. And I think right now, the Iranians, who's number one enemy of the Saudis in the region, they must be laughing at the Saudis, at the blunders the Saudis are making, the problems they are making and creating for themselves. So we still actually need to know so many answers to the questions that have been asked about Jamal Khashoggi, to understand the full scale of this case and how the Turks will be responding, how the Americans will be responding, how the whole international community actually will be responding, because violating the sovereignty of a country in this flagrant way actually is going to have some sort of a response by, I think, so many countries, because nobody would like actually to see somebody killed on their territories the way, or disappearing actually in their territories the way actually Jamal Khashoggi did in Istanbul.
Well, Ambassador Murphy, we heard now from President Trump. We also heard Mike Pompeo calling for transparency. You were posted in Riyadh. You know how it works. You know how relations between, or communications between Washington and Riyadh work. So apart from the public statements, do you think they are now talking, and what kind of answers would Washington be looking at this stage?
Well, you're asking me to tell you something I have no access to.
But from the way things work usually.
Well, obviously there have been contacts between the administration in Washington and the Saudi leadership about this whole issue. The American side is handling it very carefully, very cautiously. There's a great deal at stake in terms of maintaining confidence in the Saudi leadership, a would-be partner in the peace process, an actual partner in the ongoing conflict in Yemen. These are major issues which are coming under an unexpected pressure with the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. And he is a respected member of the press.
And certainly
Washington.
He also had very good relations with the previous royal court. And he always said that he didn't like calling himself a dissident or or a member of the opposition. Now, Khalil, just moving this a bit forward, Senator Lindsey Graham said that if these allegations of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi come true, then there will be serious consequences. And he actually said devastating consequences, and that Saudi will pay a heavy price. Do you really think that would happen?
I doubt it to the extent or the emotional extent that the senator described, but I think there could be. I could see a scenario, particularly, depending on the results of the investigation. If indeed we're talking about a disappearance, a potential release soon, or a murder with a sense of permanence here. So if indeed the second scenario materializes, I would say there is a credible body of criticism or opposition to Saudi Arabia in Congress that might be revitalized. The Saudis have been working very hard on Capitol Hill to kind of, if you will, respond, suppress, mitigate that criticism over all kinds of issues that separate U.S. interests from Saudi interests. But this crisis, if it mushrooms into a full-scale crisis, as I anticipate, I think is apt to revitalize and strengthen that criticism in Congress when you see both Republicans and, unlike in the past, mostly Democrats, now you see some Republicans jumping on the bandwagon and warning of a potential deterioration. So in light of the differences over the issue of oil and OPEC and cooperation between the Washington and Riyadh, now you have a very serious crisis that cuts across the divide in Washington and might, particularly it depends on if indeed the president is concerned, as he expressed last night about this crisis, even though he said no one knows anything, I'm sure he does know something. After all, this has been 1 week of a crisis, a serious crisis, and I'm sure he has been briefed. If he attended those briefings the past 7 days, I'm sure he has a lot of information about this crisis because the U.S. intelligence does have a lot of information, particularly in light of cooperation with our other ally in Ankara, in Turkey. I'm sure he has seen a lot of information, and that explains his second sentence when he says, I do not like it. So what is it that he doesn't like? And if indeed he doesn't like what he heard, then that is going to translate into some criticism and opposition in Congress.
Okay, so let me ask Marwan, when President Trump says, I don't like it, how do you think it's going to translate in facts?
Well, I don't know. I know that this guy actually, his foreign policy approach, he's having this transactional foreign policy approach. And I don't know, I feel like he might be using it against the Saudis, but not because he's concerned about human rights, let's say, for example, because he has not been really concerned about human rights when we talk about, for example, Yemen, or when we talk about the Saudis' poor record in terms of human rights. But I don't know, I felt like there is this sort of tension between his administration and the Saudi administration in recent weeks, actually, when he talked about that the Saudis should pay more, perhaps.
Well, actually, talking about it, I'm just going to interrupt you because I just wanted to say that President Trump has been stepping up the rhetoric against Saudi Arabia recently. A couple of weeks ago, he hit out at the Saudi-led OPEC oil cartel for pushing up prices. He tweeted, "We protect the countries of the Middle East. They would not be safe for very long without us, and yet they continue to push for higher and higher oil prices. We will remember the OPEC monopoly must get prices down now." And at a campaign rally last week, this is what the US president said about the Saudi ruler.
We protect Saudi Arabia. Would you say they're rich? And I love the king, King Solomon, but I said, "King, we're protecting you. You might not be there for 2 weeks without us. You have to pay for your military."
Well, Marwan, I think this goes straight in what you were trying to say.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted actually to say. I was trying actually to say that he might be using this as a leverage in order to get something from the Saudis, be that on the oil prices or be that on paying perhaps more in order to protect them. What I know is that the Saudis don't like this way of addressing them, of course, and this has actually generated the sort of response by the Saudi Crown Prince a few days ago when he said that we are paying actually the United States for whatever we buy from the United States in terms of weapons and equipments. So I think this is exactly what I feel that this administration will be trying to do when they talk to the Saudis about Jamal Khashoggi, maybe.
Well, Ambassador Murphy, do you agree with that there is a certain level of frustration lately in Washington about Riyadh, and that this story in itself might just be used as an excuse to pressure Saudi Arabia and get out of it what the Trump administration wants?
I don't see it that way. I don't think that the administration is looking for a stick with which to hit the Saudis over oil pricing, for instance. I'd be careful about over-interpreting some of the quick comments that the president makes. He says one thing and then the next day he's modified it, or an advisor said, well, that isn't what he meant. So I repeat, the relationship is an important one. It's been a sturdy one, not without tensions. But I don't see this developing into a major crisis between Saudi Arabia and the United States.
Okay, and you know that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has had this image over the past few years of being this young reformer. He's allowing women to drive, he's opened movie theaters, and he went on a quite successful tour in the US. He even praised Silicon Valley. But there is a sort of more oppressive side to him that some Saudis would tell you about, female activists being detained and a whole long list of quite prominent people in Saudi Arabia. Do you think at least that image that he's been trying to impose quite successfully in the West will be a little bit shaken by this Jamal Khashoggi disappearance?
It won't help the image, no question. When you see a prominent journalist involved and seen as a victim of another government, that triggers a very quick emotional response in the United States.
Okay, well, international pressure has been growing on Saudi in the Khashoggi case. The U.S. has voiced concern, and this is what the UN had to say.
We're very concerned about a number of recent cases and reports of violence against journalists, including the murder of Victoria Marinova in Bulgaria, the reported disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Both publicly and privately, the Secretary General has often raised this issue with member states. The Secretary General's position is clear. A free press is essential for peace, justice, and human rights for all. He reiterates his call on all governments to strengthen press freedom, including ensuring that there is justice and accountability for crimes committed against journalists.
Well, Khalil, I mean, now let's look at the EU a bit. It is the place where freedom of speech and they kind of champion it, human rights and freedom of speech and all the rest of it. How do you think, apart from the official statements we've heard, do you think there will be any kind of impact there between the relationship between the two sides?
I think there will be. This crisis is mushrooming into a major affair that is unprecedented in a way. It's going to surprise, I bet, all the parties involved. I mean, when you look at the statement by or on behalf of the Secretary General of the UN, at least it had some kind of moral and political detail in it that is needed to make a difference. That's what the US statement was lacking. Even the European, with all due respect, statements by multiple countries also were lacking. So they will not have the initial impact. But should the crisis escalate, as most of us kind of expect it analytically to do, until we know the actual results of the investigation, I would say that these statements would escalate, they would change, they will have a little bit more detail. We might get to know exactly what the President of the United States means when he says, I don't like it, whether he is just talking superficially or whether he has some specific information at his disposal that is causing his discomfort. But to continue to expect after 7 days of a crisis of this magnitude that is escalating because it is basically dealing with a figure that has become, like it or not, larger than life. Yes, there are many people around the world that get kidnapped and that get killed daily that nobody pays attention to. But the fact that it was Khashoggi, it was at this particular time, in this particular method, the fact that the media immediately focused on something that happened to one of their colleagues. Allegedly by a country that presents itself as run by a reformer. All that, I think, is contributing to the escalation and might have a larger than life impact in terms of dealing with these issues, including freedoms that in the past, with all due respect to all these people that are making these statements, whether it's the US or Europeans or the UN, they seem to somehow, treat the Arab world and the Muslim world with a sense of exception, as if it's not entitled fully to the same freedoms and to the same rights.
Well, Marwan, the last word for you. Saudi Arabia is going through transformation, something that even Jamal Khashoggi has repeated more than once, even though he doesn't agree with the way it's been done. Do you think that, considering how this crisis just became of such magnitude, the royal court at this stage will be rethinking its ways? What kind of damage control will it try to do?
Well, I don't really know because we don't know how this court is run in the first place. We don't know who's in charge in Saudi Arabia. Is it King Salman, or is it Mohammed bin Salman, or is it the advisors who are giving Mohammed bin Salman this bad advice? Because certainly what happened in Istanbul was a very big miscalculation in my opinion. And if the Saudis thought that actually by having these extreme measures against Canada a few weeks ago, when the Canadian Foreign Ministry tweeted concerning the detention of human rights activists in Saudi Arabia, would scare off all governments in the world if they do something like this against, let's say, Jamal Khashoggi. I think that must be a very big miscalculation. I think the way Saudi Arabia is run today, especially in terms of its foreign policy, is a mixture of arrogance and ignorance, to the extent that they are, as I said before, they are moving from one crisis into another. And the way, if they want to control the damage right now, is going to be, in my opinion, very difficult to do that at this particular stage. Indeed, I agree with Ambassador Murphy. I'm not expecting a major crisis between Saudi Arabia and the United States, but I expect that the whole world will be looking in a very different way to Saudi Arabia and to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman if it's proved that Jamal Khashoggi is murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
Well, Jamal Khashoggi has been living in self-imposed exile, and he said many times that at this moment there was no space for debate in the kingdom when it comes to journalists and intellectuals. What happened to him still remains a mystery, but certainly it could very well prove that what he has been saying all along is true. But we have now reached the end of this conversation, so thanks to all our guests, Ambassador Richard Murphy, Khalil Jahshan, and Marwan Kabalan. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hoda Abdel-Hamid, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.